My name is Heather Viles and I'm co-leader of the Oxford University Heritage Network. I'm joined this afternoon by Oliver Cox, the other co-leader of the network, alongside Catherine Wilhelm, Blaine Tegamada and Catherine Jang. And together we'd like to warmly welcome you to this afternoon's OUHN summer event. Please note that audience members will be muted throughout the introductions and presentations, but that there will be a chance to ask questions via the Q&A channel. And during the Q&A session, we will choose as many questions as we can and unmute people so that if they want, they can ask their questions directly. We apologise in advance if anything goes wrong with the technology and ask you to bear with us while we try and sort things out. In the event of any major technological glitch, if things simply aren't rescuable, then we'll try and reschedule the session. Oxford University Heritage Network brings together researchers and heritage professionals within the University of Oxford and externally to address the big questions facing heritage locally, nationally and globally. We define heritage very broadly to cover cultural and natural heritage, including geoheritage, as well as tangible and intangible forms of heritage. The network has 6 thematic priority areas focusing on heritage and conflict, development, technology, health, environmental change and identity. And today's event links 3 of our priority themes, so heritage and conflict and identity and technology, and is deliberately designed to be interdisciplinary and broad in approach. The title of the event, Loss of Home and Heritage, How Should We Respond?, focuses on the observation that around the world, people's homes and heritage are becoming increasingly lost because of human and natural disasters. And we wanted urgently to ask how best, as heritage professionals and researchers based in the University of Oxford, we can respond to these tragedies. The event focuses explicitly on home and heritage, as we regard the two as being inseparable. And this has become increasingly evident to all of us during the coronavirus pandemic, when lockdown has forced us all to stay at home. Our homes and our local areas have become increasingly valuable to us as spaces not only in which to work and live, but also spaces in which we gain solace. Our local heritage sites and environments, often underappreciated and unloved, have suddenly taken on much greater significance. And for many of us, this new focus on home and our local environment has made us appreciate more fully the dreadful roles that conflict and natural disasters play in causing the loss of home and the loss of real connections between people, their homes and their heritage. So this event brings together a social scientist, Amar Azuz, a humanities scholar, Leah Kostner, and an engineer, Sinan Echigots, all from the University of Oxford. And you'll hear from each of them shortly. But first, I'm enormously honoured to welcome, on behalf of the network, Lise Doucette as the chair for this afternoon's event. Lise is the BBC's chief international correspondent and a senior presenter who anchors news programmes for BBC World News TV and BBC World Service Radio. She's regularly deployed to present special news coverage in the field and report across the BBC's domestic and global outlets. She was nominated to the Order of Canada in 2018 and received an OBE in 2014 for services to broadcasting. Lise, thank you so much for joining us, and I'll now pass over control of this event to you.
Thank you so much, Heather. Leave it to the great scholars of our time to get a journalist in to control things so that if things go wrong, you can always say, well, you know, that's what happens when you invite a journalist into our you know, our august and elegant halls. Thank you so much, Heather, and thank you to all of you who are joining us on this glorious sunny day, if you are indeed living in a part of the world and a part of Britain where the sun is shining. It's such a pleasure and a privilege to be part of this Oxford University Heritage Network. And I think it promises to be not just an essential close focus on heritage and home of our time, but also a very illuminating one. And sadly, it is the character of our time is that we're not just focusing on destruction of and atrocities of times past, but also, sadly, the destruction of heritage and home, which is happening on our watch and in our time. And I've often heard from some of the leading historians and anthropologists and architects of our time lamenting that for decades they covered centuries past, even ancient history, and never thought that they would have to then look, analyze, discuss destruction and atrocities which are happening in our own time. And I joined this discussion, and I'm not just joking that it is an honor to be among these leading scholars of these issues of our time, but as a journalist who, sadly, for better or worse, has seen up close some of the conflicts and wars and natural disasters which have created these landscapes of loss that we'll be thinking about today. And in my own work as a journalist, I often say that no matter how complex and consequential these political and geopolitical stories are, and they don't get any more complex and consequential than in our own time, that when you drill down, they are essentially and fundamentally stories about mothers and fathers and families and streets and societies. They are human stories. So they're stories of loss, but they're also stories of resilience and hopefully renewal and birth. So we very much hope that today's special event, they will of course evoke emotions of loss and longing and sadness, but also we hope that they will also evoke a sense of resolve, and that sense of possibility, that for all of the destruction, it is still possible to rebuild, to renew, and to reimagine in enlightening and also powerful and very personal ways. So to help us on this discussion of today, we have all of you who are joining us, and there will be a time for you to ask your questions. But we have, as Heather said, a leading social scientist, a digital engineer, and a structural engineer who help us to reimagine and then to actually rebuild. But we're very privileged to first have the work, the very profound work, digital work of Amar Azzouz. And even though he is someone he's become a friend, but on top of that, he's someone who's benefited from the scholarship of some of the world's leading universities. But perhaps his best school of all was the School of Life, and that is growing up in Syria, in the wonderful city of Homs, where I've been privileged to spend a great deal of time. And he has sadly left part of his home, and part of his heart still lies there. And it is that sense of heart and home that drives the video and his comments that we're about to hear. In his video, which looks everywhere from Poland to Bosnia, and then to Spain, as well as to Syria. So let me please hand over to Amar Azzouz.
Thank you very much, Liz, for this kind and generous introduction. And thanks a lot for accepting to be with us today. It's a true honor to have you. First of all, I just want to say thanks for the Oxford University Heritage Network for making this a possible event, and especially to Professor Heather Vires, who is my academic mentor and supervisor, for all the encouragement and the solidarity. Thanks also for Liz. I remember I met you in the US Embassy in 2017, and I asked you if you are the same person who was reporting from the Yarmouk camp in Syria, where I told you, I just saw that recently, so was that you? And you said yes. So thanks a lot for bringing us so close to the human struggle of people in cities under siege. Thanks also for the film director who helped me enormously on this, Sophie Bernberg, and for my colleagues at Arab Community Engagement, and for every person who provided us with footages inside Iraq, inside Syria, who sent us all the materials to make this possible. In today's presentation, I will be speaking about the loss of home, and what does it mean to lose our home? What does it mean to lose our homeland, to lose the familiar places around us, and the streets and the shops and the schools that we know, when everything around us is changing and the people that we used to know are no longer there? What does that all mean in a time that we are now sitting inside home, but many people wouldn't have that privilege of having a home? What does it mean to lose your own city that you spent all your entire life living in, to be uprooted and displaced from your own homeland, to lose your home, to lose your friends, but not only the physical sense of losing your physical home, but the sense of belonging to places of identity and dignity. In this video project, I try to raise some of these questions, and I hope that you can find some of these themes explored in the video. It brings together stories of people who have been impacted by the conflict. As in Iraq, you have an interview with somebody inside Iraq, and also with Abir Abdelal, a lecturer based inside Homs, and she's watching us today. So these are the voices from the ground, but also you have residents who are living now in exile, as two Syrians who live now in London, and academics who study conflicts across the history and in different parts of the world, as in Bosnia, Poland, and Spain, coming to very recent conflict as in Syria. But why do we need these individual stories? Why do we need to hear about these voices of struggle from the people? At the time, we have all this big news about high-level and competing powers and agendas about the conflict. Because at the time of this chaos and social injustice and mass information and news, this voice is often lost. The voices of the people who are finding themselves living for years and years in Syria, almost a decade now, over 9 years, inside a war-torn and ruined city. So let me tell you a little bit about some of these stories that I tried to look at in my research, interviewing people to understand the war through their lenses, to understand the war through the human suffering of people paying the price of this conflict. I went last year, for instance, to Greece, to Moria camp in Lesbos Island, and I met a woman with a headscarf in her 60s. She looked to me Syrian, and we looked at each other. So I said, marhaba, hello. She replied in Arabic, and we started having a chat. She said, marhaba. I asked her where she's from. She said, I'm from Aleppo. She says she's living as an asylum seeker in the island in a camp with other 15 people she doesn't know inside a small box. But she was amongst the lucky ones because she had the metal box surrounding her. Others on the camp were living inside a tent. She told me, I lost everything in Aleppo, my house and my family. But further to that statement, I couldn't ask her any more questions because I knew how painful it is to describe all this loss, literally losing everything, family members, the home. So during my research and the interviews that I did in the last few years, I also interviewed people who are displaced internally inside Syria. As Muna, one of the women who is in her late 20s, displaced from Homs and inside Homs, the countryside. She told me that she lost her friends who were in their 20s, and she has been forcibly displaced. She also spent her everyday life working in other professions, not in her own profession, just to support her elderly parents. She felt ambivalent about home, and she asked me, are the days after the fights more difficult than the war itself, referring to the end of the fights in the city, but not to the everyday struggle. She told me every day is war. And this sense of every day is war is that what I was interested in during these interviews, looking at the everyday experiences within the city, the loss of everyday spaces, the soft targets of bakery shops, how cities have become the battlefield and how the front lines are fought within the city, destroying, as in Homs, more than half of the neighborhoods are heavily destroyed in Homs. More than half of the Syrian population is displaced either inside or outside the country. Umama Zankawan, who is one of the interviewees in this video, and she's also today, told me that she has been displaced 10 times, within 8 years inside Syria. So more than 6 million people are internally displaced people inside the country. Eventually done as she got a scholarship to study here, but her family still live inside. She told me the time she moved with her parents after her first home was destroyed and bombed, the front light followed them. So the second time where they moved somewhere else and they started furnishing it, it was bombed again and they had to leave it. She told me her mother is no longer interested in decorating or furnishing any place, as if she's fearful of the catastrophic collapse that will be following them. So how could people live in this catastrophic collapse? And where cities are the front lines, as in many countries, not only in my own country, Syria, but also in places as Yemen, Iraq, and Libya. How do people carry on with their everyday life when everything around them is radically being transformed and changing? This constant sense of loss for almost a decade now in some countries, as in Syria. Each time you talk to the people inside a war zone, these stories evoke a sense of loss, as if the world has no stable center for them, as if those who physically have homes still feel that they have a sense of homelessness or strangerhood. But even when talking to those who now live in diaspora, like the refugees living in the comfort of Berlin or London or Istanbul, you still have the same weight of struggle, the sense of losing something bigger than just being at home somewhere else, but seeing that their homeland is being destroyed from afar. Every time hearing these stories, these painful and difficult testimonies pull you to their world, taking you with them to the ground, to their ruined cities and collapsed homes, to their intimate emotions and profound sense of loss. It's a sense of exile even for people who still reside in their own cities. The details that bring forward, they all make the stories of the time of conflict. A woman, for instance, tells me she struggles after surviving cancer to find her medicine now with the collapse of the economy, for instance. She also struggles to find treatment in her own city. Others tell me about the loss of their family members without being able to go and say the final goodbye for them if they are in different places. All these senses of losses are what they have been brought to the people struggling with the conflict. But this all sounds very dark and full of sadness and grief. But as one of my colleagues, Syrian living in Canada, talked to me a few weeks ago, telling me about her research and we exchanged ideas, she said, we cannot just sit down and wait in grief. And now what you can see that across the world, Syrian refugees and other displaced communities are writing and rewriting and imagining and reimagining a sense of home even outside of their country. So writing their biographies of home through these human stories, through research and writing and poetry and literature. In this video project, I hope to contribute to what my fellow Syrians are doing to bring some knowledge to the understanding of the conflict, but also to bring a beacon of hope, looking at different cities that they have suffered so much, as in cities like Homs and Raqqa and Aleppo. Spending time reading about conflict and cities in history have allowed me to imagine a future at times where many of us are struggling even to imagine an alternative vision about the future. This video is very unpolished, it's very rough, and it's so incomplete, but it's open for discussion, and I hope that it opens conversations and questions through comparative urbanism, looking at different cities as in Warsaw that has been heavily destroyed in the history. It includes a series of interviews with academics, as I mentioned, including Dacia Fiechorose, who wrote this book. So I have the book with me, Reconstructing Spain. So trying to learn from these experiences, how cities, as in Guernica and towns, have been rebuilt. And also with Dr. Martin Coward, who wrote Orbicide, or The Killing of the Urban, and he focuses on Bosnia. But also we have Dean Sharp, who is at LSE, who studies conflicts in different regions, and Joanna Kosiak from the University of Cambridge, and also an academic, Abir Abdelal, who teaches architecture inside Homs. And also we have residents who are living in London, and one of our colleagues who works for the Danish Refugee Council in Mosul, Iraq. So I'm grateful to all of them for being part of this project. Sari and Najib inside Iraq, just to mention the name. Back at these ruined cities, and it's in Warsaw and Guernica, it looks almost impossible that such devastated cities could have been rebuilt, but yet history shows us that with the resilience of people, the strength of their power, we can rebuild these cities and perhaps look at a beacon of hope, at a miracle that the city and its people are waiting for, as once Joanna Kosiak told me, the city is waiting for the miracle. It's this radical and almost slow hope that I try to look at in this video, hoping, imagining and reimagining that cities as Homs, Raqqa, Taiz and Mosul are rebuilt again for their people. So that's me, and I'll be sharing my screen. It might be quite poor quality, bear with me if it's not technically working well. We can share it after the event. So I will share my screen now.
Cities don't lie. They reflect their communities in a way or another. Hom's nickname before 2011 was the mother of the poor. It wasn't attractive to big investors or tourists. It didn't witness important events and rarely hosted VIP visits, but it was a poor resident-friendly city. You didn't need to be rich to live and enjoy life inside it. With few landmarks, thriving center, calm but vibrant neighborhoods, life in Homs was as simple and peaceful as could be. War had carved deep scars in the city. Healing process will take quite a long time. The city which was once the mother of the poor will proceed to be the mother of the poorest. Now the city will speak out again about its people. It will tell you that wealthy and skilled residents had left the site, while poor and low-income ones had to stay, and the poorest had to come back to reoccupy their partially destroyed buildings.
After we left our house, we heard that it was destroyed. So we left to my grandmother's house, then we left to my uncle's house, then we left to some long distance relatives. Then we went back to Homs, then we rented a house, then we had to leave for another house because of the bombing. So we changed 10 houses in 8 years. Then in 2016, I think 20 people were living there. People were gathering themselves. The neighbors were talking that if we go all of us back at the same time, we would feel like home again. So they were encouraging each other to go back and encouraging that the shops to open so they would feel that the life is back there. So it was slow, but eventually it happened. Even now, because half the city is closed, the areas, the roads, everything, it's completely new. Even me, I don't feel like this is the city that I used to live in. It's completely different. Even the people who are living there, it's very different. So I don't feel that this is the city which I grew in.
Yes, so this was the video. Thanks a lot for the support with the technical issues. And I think we can drop the link in the chat. So the intent was to screen only 5 minutes of it. So I hope people can have a look at it and come with suggestions or feedback. And yeah, so that's my part. Thanks a lot for listening.
Thank you so much, Amar. And we were so lucky to be able to see it twice, some parts of it, in case we missed a little bit of it the first time. But such a powerful project on the physical loss, but also the profound personal loss, and even the title itself, Cities Don't Lie, which means the subtext is, well, cities and the built environment, or what's left of it and what's left in people's hearts don't lie. But of course, warmongers do lie and try to minimize and even to erase these landscapes of loss. But fortunately, we have both the people now as well as the technology to be able to bring these to life, and hopefully someday the vision to bring them physically back to life in some way. I love the way that you started with your introduction, posing almost a rhetorical question: why do we have to tell individual stories? And you meet Hannah from Aleppo, and I'm sure many people on this call would have lamented when the first reports came out of the destruction of the 13th century citadel, the majestic medieval citadel in Aleppo, and you would have also cried, and many did, when the Al Medina Souk, the largest covered market, the ancient souk in Aleppo, was also destroyed and burned in the fighting there. But probably it is the first time for all of us to hear about Hannah's story and how her house was destroyed, not once, but twice, and perhaps again, so much so now that her mother doesn't want to decorate. It is a story that all of us can relate to because it is a human story. And I've often said that the word home in the English language must be the most evocative word of all, because all of us, especially now, since we've been the hashtag stay at home for so long, we have powerful emotions which are evoked when we talk about home, which of course is also not just the home, which is the capsule for all of our memories, but it's also our heritage and the way we've lived and so much that we hold near and dear in our lives. So thank you very much. That has set out, this has set out a foundation for us to continue our discussion. Now the challenge, the baton will be sent to Sinan and to Leah to help us move on from this landscape of loss to imagine something different. So Leah, to you now.
Thank you so much for having me. And I will try to do a screen share, but if that doesn't work, Katrin will help me. So I wanted to contribute to the discussion and follow up on Amar's poignant account with what I hope will be a hopeful note of how technology can help us preserve heritage in conflict-stricken zones. Within our lifetime, as we have heard, we have seen an acceleration of loss of heritage sites due to war and terrorism. Many of these were important cultural treasures, which were millennia old and which remain irretrievably lost. Perhaps the most well-known example, as it made international headlines, is the bombing of Palmyra in Syria in 2015, when militants destroyed 3 of the best preserved Tao tombs, the lion statue, the cella of the Temple of Bel, and the cella of the Temple of Bel. And I was hoping to share an example that is of the Buddhas of Banyam, which were created in the 6th century in present-day Afghanistan. They were a product of the Gan Haram culture, which we know actually very little about. And these were sites which remained a testament to the Indo-Greco world. So in 2001, they were bombed by the Taliban. And to my knowledge, they have not been captured previous to these attacks, except through photographs. So the statues themselves remain irretrievably lost. And although nothing can recapture the value of the historical, cultural, and psychological value of these original monuments, we can capture their physical appearance to try to archive, preserve, and perhaps assist in the recovery and the rebuilding process. So I want to take this opportunity today to introduce you to some techniques for doing so and to discuss how technology can help in the process. So let's move to the next slide. Actually, I think this one is previous one. So let's try again. Yes, excellent. So one of these technologies is terrestrial laser scanning, or TLS. It is one of the most advanced measurement techniques for the 3D documentation of buildings and sites. Scans can be used to accurately measure and virtually reposition partially or fully destroyed ornaments and other architectural elements. So it makes it a very powerful technique. And an example of this is the scan of the Church of St. Simeon Stylites in Syria. The church dates back to the 5th century and was partially destroyed by a Russian rocket attack in 2016. Now, luckily, since 2003, the site had been regularly surveyed by crews from France and was thus recorded and preserved in digital form. The cruciform church seen in this picture was captured from 36 positions using a Trimble TLS device. And now if we can move to the next slide. So another technique is photogrammetry. The technique derives from multiple overlapping photographs of the same sites or objects. These images are used to derive precise measurements and create accurate 3D models. It is similar to the panorama feature on modern smartphone cameras, which stitch together several overlapping photographs to create a 2D panorama. And the image you see here is that of a Roman statue, which was scanned, processed, and then recreated as a 3D model, which was later used in a video game. So I wanted to end my very short response by highlighting a company which I think is doing very admirable work in this area, which is called Iconem. So maybe we can move to the next slide. So this company is a French company, and it specializes in the digitization of endangered cultural heritage sites in 3D. And the company has developed an innovative way of recording threatened cultural heritage sites by combining drone, laser, and photogrammetry technologies. They have ventured into conflict areas and war zones to capture these sites, which many of which were destroyed soon after the images were taken. And I believe that their work remains a model of what can be achieved in this field. And I hope that we can do more together to try to capture and preserve some of these very unique, important cultural heritage monuments and cultural sites. Thank you very much.
Leah, since you took so little of our time, I'm just going to ask you one question, which will just open up the conversation a little bit and get people thinking for when we later have the questions. It's so interesting. Your work combines both Imagineer and Engineer. But I'm wondering, because there's a big debate which goes on about whether those ancient structures should be rebuilt. For example, you showed the niche where one of the ancient Buddhas of Bamiyan was. And as you know, there's been discussion, should you rebuild that statue with the stones which are still lying there? There's been light shows which create a hologram inside. And opinion is divided even among Afghans about whether you should leave that as it is, as a reminder, because the destruction of the Buddhas by the Taliban in 2001 is also part of the history, or should they be recreated again? And people may remember, they may have even have seen how they recreated the Triumphal Arch from Palmyra in Trafalgar Square. And it felt, of course, it wasn't the same size, but it was something to touch and to feel, and again, to reimagine. So where do you stand on that issue?
Well, thank you so much for that question. I think it's a very sensitive issue, of course, and it's up to the communities themselves to decide how best to approach this. But I've seen some, I think, very successful examples in Germany after the bombing from the World War II, where churches have been reconstructed, and the original stones from the church were left in a different color, so that you can see within the wall what's reconstruction and what is actually original. So to me, I thought that was a very successful way of flagging that this was a modern monument, but also that it had pieces of it from the past. And in my own native country of Romania, there's a theater in Bucharest, which was actually destroyed after an earthquake. And I think the site has been bought by a hotel. So they were going to develop a new hotel, but they decided to reconstruct the foyer and the facade, the kind of the ground level of that theater, and then build on top of it a very modern hotel with glass windows, basically a tower. And that actually has gotten very positive reviews from the citizens of Bucharest, which have seen it as a reminder of that theater which had been lost, but a very kind of beautiful way of integrating both the old and the new. So I think that there's just different approaches, and there's no clear-cut answer, and it's up to the community to reimagine and to ultimately decide how to approach the preservation, the reconstruction of some of these sites.
Very good. I'm sure it'll come up in the questions, and may we note your emphasis that it's up to the community to decide. And sadly, as Amar knows all too well, that sometimes in the embers of wars, and even wars that still continue, it's the powerful in society, the developers looking to make money and who's got visions of Dubai in their mind, that they will reimagine and rebuild in ways which are an affront to the community. So that's something, again, we can discuss in the questions. And may I just bring a thread into here which links Amar's presentation to Leah's. I was fortunate in 2015 to visit Palmyra after one of the stages of the war, when Syrian government forces took it back, and we saw the ruins of this time added to the Roman ruins of the past. And I was taken aback to discover that there is a little city right next, little town right next to the ruins of Palmyra. And in fact, there was so much destruction and loss there in the homes next to this heritage. And of course, it was the heritage. It rightfully got a lot of attention. But people also lost a lot in their own streets and in their neighborhoods. And that also is something that we must be mindful of in looking at the loss of this destruction in our time, and very much at the heart of what Amar does. So we've had the architect, the designer, the Imagineer, we've had the design engineer, and now it's to the man of science, the engineer, Sinan, the great Turk, who's going to come and tell us how he sees going forward this discussion of home and heritage. Sinan.
Thank you, Lise. I should apologize from the outset if there are any technical difficulties. I would hope not, but we'll see. I'll share my screen and share with you a presentation. Hopefully it should all go good. Can everybody see my screen now? Yeah? Yeah, excellent, good. I'll talk what my talk is going to be slightly different from the previous talks, because I'll focus on natural hazards. I'm very careful to call these natural hazards and not disasters. When I talk about natural hazards, I'm talking about earthquakes. Here's a photo from the CTV building from Christchurch, which collapsed in the 2011 earthquake and caused a loss of more than 100 lives. And to the right, you've got a bridge which collapsed during the Yorkshire floods, which resulted in loss of services to a part of the community there. And aside from natural hazards, there are also man-made hazards. We've seen conflict as a man-made hazard, but there are other hazards which happen daily beneath our feet, which we don't recognize sometimes. For instance, tunnels being constructed in the City of London is something we work on. And you can see on the bottom right what happened to a building in Amsterdam, where movements due to tunnels were not properly controlled, and this building became inhabitable after earthquake, resulting in loss of home for some people. So there are multiple aspects to this problem, but I'll talk about one that resonates with me, and that's earthquakes. I grew up in Turkey and lived through the 1999 Izmit earthquake. I wasn't at that city at that time. I grew up in Istanbul, which is where I was. And I was fortunate that no one close to me died during this earthquake, but it killed 17,000 people over a minute. It left 250,000 people homeless, and there were economic losses exceeding $20 billion, which is huge. 11 years afterwards, there were a series of earthquakes in Christchurch. New Zealand is a bit better equipped than Turkey in some ways. This earthquake killed far fewer people, but it still left 10,000 people homeless. And the economic losses were very similar to what was experienced in Turkey. And this brings up interesting questions from an engineering point of view, which is what I'll try to address today, which is why do these natural hazards, which we ought to be prepared for, are causing so much damage and losses? And that is because this has something to do with the engineering. We engineer most of our modern buildings so that they are economically viable, but that also means that we design them to get damaged during an earthquake. So the damage is what allows the buildings to survive the earthquake, because it sucks up the energy that is given from the ground to the building. So that results in damaged buildings being too expensive to repair most of the times. And in Christchurch, what we saw was, you've got a map of Christchurch on the right. This is from a few years ago, so this probably changed. But you can see the buildings in the Christchurch Central Business District, which had to be demolished after the earthquake. And only 2 buildings collapsed, but these hundreds of buildings that you see over there had to be demolished because they were just too expensive to repair. And that is part of the reason why homes were lost and why there were huge economic losses. Loss of homes in city centre led to many different things, but when I was a visitor there for a year, there are two images which stuck with me. And I've got these two images on the screen. One of them is this image, which was an art installation of the signpost, which was showing these locations to nearby parking in 70 meters, 150 meters. And these were all spots of previous buildings which had to be demolished. The city was full of buildings which had to be demolished. The other image, which is quite poignant also, is this image from the Canterbury Museum, which is a dollhouse, which also experienced the earthquake. And you can see how in the dollhouse, some of the tea sets are littered on the ground, the baby's on the ground, some of these frames on the walls are completely tilted. So I did not experience the earthquake there, but these images bring to me how important it is, how important homes are, and how people cling on to that memory. These have made me reflect on the engineering role in minimizing the loss of homes. There are multiple things that us engineers can do, and I'll just try to focus on that because I think that's probably an area where I feel more comfortable to talk about. But this is only, I recognize that this is only a small part of the issue. And I'll specifically talk about what structural engineers can do, because there are many types of engineers, many types of different disciplines which can contribute to this problem. One of the important things that have been happening since the Christchurch earthquake is we have now a focus on repairable design. So we design our buildings now to make sure that you can replace just parts of the building after the earthquake, which get damaged, and rest of the building remains usable. And this is an idea, what you see on the screen is an idea, where buildings rock on their foundations. Instead of being fixed firmly to the ground, they rock back and forth. And there are small fuses, perhaps you can see my mouse, which do get damaged, allow the earthquake energy to be dissipated by the building, and which can get replaced. So this is an idea that's been implemented already in New Zealand with positive results. So this is something this changing emphasis is something that's come out of that event. The second emphasis that is quite interesting is what happens if people have to go out to temporary shelters after an earthquake. And this inevitably has to happen because there will be some amount of damage in the existing building stock, and these buildings need to be assessed so that people can go back to them. And temporary shelters, although the name is temporary, they can be shelters for people for very, very long amounts of time. And here is some work that I find very interesting, which I also got to know of in Christchurch. This is work by an architect, actually, not a structural engineer, called Shigeru Ban. And he's been working on this subject since 1990s. And the idea Shigeru Ban had was to use cardboard instead of other materials, which are very difficult to find in a post-earthquake situation, to build temporary shelters. And he spoke to a lot of the people who live in these shelters to understand what sort of conditions they need. In Christchurch, what was very beautiful for me to see was this Christchurch Cardboard Cathedral, which is an extension of this idea, built from cardboard by cheap materials, which was an inspiration to the people who could not practice in their own church because it was demolished. So these are something that people have done. There are things that we try to do here in the UK in a separate context to understand, to at least help, to find ways to help post-earthquake damage assessments in these situations. One of the things that we do is to use surveying and monitoring technologies to understand existing assets better. This is what you're seeing now is a masonry arch. This is a railway bridge structure, and this is actually a point cloud, very similar to what Leah was showing. But we've taken these point clouds, we have compared them. We have taken different point clouds over time, and we've compared them to see how this railway is deforming over time. And that is something that's very valuable if you need to assess a building after an earthquake. You want to see how much it has moved and make your assessments on its safety on the basis of qualitative information. And this sort of technology can help with that. There are other techniques that we've used. again, in a different context. This is a Christopher Wren church from London, which we've been monitoring while it was being tunneled under with these cables that you see around. These cables are small glass fiber cables, and they are sometimes described as glass nervous systems, which can describe how a building behaves during an action. In this case, it was tunneling, so we could see how these cracks were growing or getting smaller during the tunneling works. This sort of technology can obviously scale up and work in cities, but there are bigger challenges there in post-earthquake that need to be dealt with. There are other big problems, and again, there's probably limited time to go through all of that, but one of the biggest problems is the existing building stock. And when we talk about heritage, I always think about the existing buildings that we have, buildings which have been there for a very, very long time, but which have never been designed for earthquakes. And predicting their behavior is a big challenge because we do not know the materials they were built in. To estimate their behavior into the future is a difficult challenge, and coming up with suitable methods that will be that will ensure that the building can survive for generations more is also a big challenge. And there are very interesting engineering techniques that we can use for these things. I've got some photos of techniques that you can use to put jacks into the structure and then do measurements to understand how the materials behave. You can do various simulations of your structures to understand how they're deforming, and on the basis of these, make some decisions on which building to retrofit. And when you come to the idea of retrofit, then there are important challenges to make sure that you retrofit the building correctly in a way that's suitable, that will ensure that you do not damage it when you retrofit it. And there are some interesting techniques which you can use. For instance, the one that you see on the right, where there is where a brick wall is being covered up with a basalt layer and a glass fiber layer, using very small glass fibers within the matrix. And these things have got a role in making the structures last for future generations. And these are just some ideas. Obviously, there are many, many different aspects of this problem to look at, but I hope that from a structural engineering point of view, these things can contribute to these big challenges around saving up homes and heritage.
Sinan Achagos, thank you so much for such a brilliant presentation. I have to say, it's the first time I've ever heard a cardboard dwelling described as beautiful, but because it came from a presentation which was so powerful and persuasive, and in our time I emphasize scientific, I think you have convinced all of us that you have the solutions. And it's really, really heartening to see how much real thinking has gone into the structural work about how to rebuild, whether, as you said, because of natural hazards, or so natural or man-made disasters, the wars and conflicts that Amr Azuz started by telling us about. And we have to thank Leo Kostener as well for showing us all the dazzling possibilities for rebuilding and reimagining provided by the real state-of-art technology and development and design and technology of our times. And I have to say, as a journalist, I always believe good things come out of bad, and our technical faults, well, our few technical hurdles allowed us to emphasize that the people behind the scenes, like Catherine, are just as important as the people who are on the screen to keep our presentation going. And finally, of course, Amar, thank you very much again for your inspiring presentation about the profound meaning in what is lost and then what needs to be rebuilt. I'll just end rather with the very last comment, because in looking at all these buildings that have been lost, and they talk about both homes and heritage, and I assume that everyone who's on this call is here because you believe in the importance of it. But we're entering a time, of course, which is maybe a time of economic austerity, where people will say, well, really? Do you want to spend all that money on that rebuilding when people need to eat? And I'll never forget the mood in Afghanistan after the Buddhas of Bamiyan were destroyed. And the commentary was, why are you focusing on, a bunch of stones? The poor people of Afghanistan, they need food, they're hungry. and Afghans right across the political spectrum, from communist to Islamist, for the first time after decades of war, they all came out and said the same thing. How dare you deny us the dignity of believing that our heritage matters? So much has been taken away from us. Do not take away our dignity. And with that, I hand over to Heather and to you and to all of your questions.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Lise, again, for being with us and for such wise words. I'd like to go back to something that Lise said towards the beginning, that we were thinking about landscapes of loss and stories of loss and resilience. And I think all the three speakers have addressed that in some quite challenging and different ways. And I think what would be really nice now is to try and get some questions which stimulate us to try and start making connections between things. And I want to start off by asking Amar a question, which is, Amar, as a trained architect, you, out of all of us, straddle the world of the science and the arts. So what, in your opinion, are the possibilities of democratizing and making accessible some of these more high-tech things like the 3D scanning, but also the cardboard ways of coping? Are they anything that could be of any use in the dealing with the losses that you've described so powerfully in your video?
Thanks a lot, Heather, for the question. I think one of the main comments that I wanted to give about the, let's say, the digital representation of monuments or places or sites of memory is not only they are important when these sites are lost, but they are also important where people aren't allowed to go and see these places, i.e. many of the refugees, where if you're a refugee, this means that you're not allowed to return, you fear to return to your country, and therefore you cannot be with these places. And that's why the representation, the copies, the replicas of these sites, let's say it could be a church, a clock tower, a mosque, an image of them, or maybe a 3D print, these sites across outside the country are very crucial for people who have their children growing up outside the country to remember and to negotiate the past and to raise a question about where the people come from. In terms of like quick techniques, we have witnessed mass displacement of people. More than 12 million Syrians are displaced. And in many situations, these cycles of displacement are very quick and fast. For instance, only between December 2019 and March 2020, 1 million Syrians were displaced in the north and west of the country. So how can you build quickly if just for the essentials, building camps, building places where people can dwell and live and have the medical treatment if there are possibilities? So all these alternatives ways of building are crucial when you have quick cycles of displacement. But the question of the digital representation is definitely crucial for lost places, when a place is destroyed and no longer you have any trace of it, but also for places which are still existing, but people cannot have the access to it. Just to give one example, for instance, in Homs, there's a very famous clock tower, which I know Lise has visited before, and the city was under siege, the city center was under siege, so people can no longer access that site and see the clock tower. So tens of replicas, I looked at YouTube videos, people rebuilt that clock tower, making a cardboard replica of it in different cities. Even once I was so astonished to see a replica of it in a refugee camp in Greece. So people just reclaiming these places of memory and places that they can no longer see throughout the physical hard copies, the digital hard copies, the paintings they make of places, all these negotiations of the memory.
Yeah, I think that's a really good answer, Amar, and it makes me want to pose a similar question to Leah. Leah, as our representative from the Encoding Heritage Network within the university, is this something you think that could link university researchers more to some of these refugee diasporas and some of these big issues?
Yes, I think certainly. we're very lucky right now that this technology has become available and very cheaply available, I think, to everyone, that there are some applications which everyone can download on their own phone, which can actually be used inside the home to create replicas. So I know that one of them is the Matterport creates actually cameras for 3D scanning buildings or rooms. And now I have heard from a friend that she has used their app, which you can just download, to create a model of a library that she works in. So I think that now this is within access to everyone, and that perhaps by piecing together these documents, we can create a record of the sites that we lost, not only which were public, but also private. Of course, one of the aspects that this technology does not capture is the personal or psychological aspect and the meaning which these places held to their inhabitants. And I'm afraid that that might be irretrievably lost, but perhaps there can be a sense of kind of community can be built by people sharing together some of these personal models or photographs to try to rebuild what was lost.
Thank you. I'd like to pose a similar question to Sinan. Are any of the engineering techniques, do you think, now available in some cheap and user-friendly format that people could use them when they're trying to reoccupy properties in these really dreadfully bombed out areas? Is that another way we could make a contribution?
I think that's an interesting thought. The technologies that Leah mentioned previously are technologies that you can use for the specific purposes that I've mentioned. So we use same sort of laser scanner, same sort of cameras, and there are economies of scale which will make these things even cheaper as time goes by. So I think there are efforts towards this area, and certainly this is something that will be important going forward. But there are wonderful techniques that for instance, satellite imagery that is made available to masses after an earthquake that could be used. So there are quite a few interesting ideas, but I would be wary to say that that the interpretation of that data is an easy task. So I think probably that's our limitation in terms of the democratization. So I would feel that there would need to be organizations in between who mediate that response, just like there has been for instance, in Holland recently, due to all of these gas extraction and earthquakes. They've set up an organization in New Zealand. There was the Earthquake Commission. So there's always a need for these organizations to understand and mediate, I think, how these technologies can be of benefit to people.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We're starting to get some questions, but I'd really encourage people to use either the chat or the Q&A panel to pose questions. We have a question on the Q&A area from Yan Yang. And Katrin, I wonder whether you can try and unmute Yan Yang and then they can pose their question.
Yang Yang should be unmuted now, if I'm not mistaken.
Maybe I'll pretend to be Yan Yang simply to put the question that they've kindly written. They ask, thank you for the interesting discussion. What was the negotiation like before the bombing of the Syrian cultural sites? Can anything be done differently to prevent such heartbreaking destruction from happening in the future? Perhaps, Amar, you would be able to answer some of that question.
I mean, difficult to answer the second part of the question of what to do to prevent such losses. But to talk a little bit about the cultural heritage before the conflict, talking about my own city, for instance, Homs, the old city of Homs, was hugely neglected. So there were a lot of the traditional and historical buildings that they were abandoned by their owners, or there was no enough support to these sites. So these sites were maybe knocked down, and they were replaced by newly built apartments or car parks. So there was that sense of losing the city, and there was a sense that nobody actually paid enough attention to protect this lost identity and lost memory. I think that touching on this question of why cultural heritage sites, like the most significant ones, have targeted, and we witness that in many conflicts across different regions, not only limited to Syria, that these sites, because they have this mirror of the civilizations, the weight of history, represent who lived in these areas, they have become the target. Because sometimes you have the people will be destroying them in almost like a performance stage. So they will be filming themselves when they are destroying it, because they know that there's a very strong message that will be reaching out to the international community that yes, we're claiming these sites. We know that it's very important. You know that the UNESCO values this. We know that the historians of these sites, we know how important these are for the local communities, and we will destroy them. So they have become like the Mostar Bridge, for instance, or Palmyra, or the Citadel in Aleppo. All these sites, they have become appeals at a time of conflict as the competing powers want to reshape the narrative. So they have become the targets, even if the fight was not in that site. So the fight shift towards the culture heritage site, as in Palmyra or in other places.
Yeah. Thank you, Emma. We've had a couple of questions from Esther Schmidt. Esther, would you like to pose your questions live? If so, Katrin will unmute you.
So Esther is now part of our panel, but the task lies with her to unmute your microphone on your own computer.
Hi there, thank you.
Okay, thanks.
I was basically just thinking aloud. So no specific questions. It was more kind of comments to the things that had been said.
Okay, well, they were very useful comments, Esther, which we enjoyed looking at, and I would encourage people to look at the chat bar. Can I turn to Ollie Cox, who I think has a question perhaps addressed
Brilliant.
to all panelists?
Yes, thanks, Heather, and thank you hugely to all of our panelists. It's been absolutely fascinating and really a really wonderful replacement for being all together in Oxford as we would have been on this day had we not all been in lockdown. My question is, and hopefully this resonates for all panelists, and Lisa, I'd be fascinated to hear your thoughts about this as well. Is that it feels to me like we're living through an unprecedented moment in the UK, at least in terms of the politicisation of public space. And I'm intrigued as to whether colleagues on this call, on this panel, have good examples of where that politicization and those different opinions as to the values of, say, for example, statues or statues on buildings in Oxford, for example, the ways in which these particularly politically resonant statues are dealt with in a way that is accommodating to a variety of different perspectives. Because my sense is at the moment we're witnessing a real polarization in terms of the deployment of the British past that for me as a historian of 18th century Britain makes me feel fundamentally uncomfortable, that one person's past is right and another person's past is wrong. And I'm really concerned as to what that's going to do to our cities in the future. Sorry, more of a long rambling question, but if colleagues had any thoughts of particular nations that have gone through maybe traumatic episodes within public space and have been able to find ways of reconciling seemingly divergent opinions, I'd be fascinated to hear. Thank you.
Hi, thank you very much, Oliver. So I'm commenting not only as an individual, but I'm commenting as someone who has set up a Center for Historic Houses in India. So I'm dealing with these questions every day. And as someone who studied I started studying European history in the 18th and 19th century, and I came to India with very little knowledge about the colonial aspect. So this is something I just started studying in the past 4 years or so. And the debate is extremely polarized and sometimes aggressive. And I find we now need to find a new way that is looking forward by looking at history in a truthful way, but not using it for polarization. And I can give you one example. Sometimes the colonial trope can be used in order to demolish historic houses. In India, we are witnessing many citizen-driven heritage initiatives which actually want the historic buildings to be used and restored, and then we have some very ruthless kind of developers who just want to demolish them, or the kind of smart city movement that just destroys a vista or a place for public recreation, or the nature that is associated with the historic buildings, because usually they come with the park. And India is one of the most polluted cities in the world as far as air pollution is concerned. So I really feel we need a new way of looking at this heritage, and also looking at the messy part of history instead of dividing history in good and bad people. Sometimes they can be both. And I think if we want to learn from history, as a historian, I'm interested in what we can learn from history. It is also that we need to be subtle. We cannot talk about the colonizers, the British, because there were many different types of people who came to India. They could be women who wanted to be married, missionaries, artists, explorers, part of the East, members of the East India Company. All of them had very different agendas. And so how do we, and while we have a lot of literature on colonial aspects and the spatial world and the built environment, we have hardly anything about the legacy today and how we deal with this today, which can be instrumentalized. And I give you another example. Last year in October, the Taj Mahal was removed from the official tourism brochure because it was regarded as being not Indian. So we have all of these kind of diverse cultures. So do we get rid of Islamic buildings? Or if we look at each and every person, shall we not listen to the music of Richard Wagner because he was an anti-Semite? Shall we no longer listen to the music of Chopin? Shall we no longer look at Caravaggio because he was a murderer? Maybe one day we'll find out we hate everybody who's not a vegetarian. So we destroy all the buildings of people who weren't vegetarians, or all buildings that were built by men because they were violent. I mean, where do we draw the line?
Lots of good thought-provoking questions there. Thank you very much. I'd like to ask all three panelists, and also Lise, if she could think about this as well. What could we do more? How could we bring together the three directions that were so carefully and nicely explained to us? So how could the stuff that Amar's doing, how could this video type of exercise to capture stories, how could that be supported perhaps by the digital technologies, and how ultimately could that be enhanced perhaps by more structural engineering kinds of approaches? A big question for which I apologise, but I'm really keen for us to think a little bit more about how we can bring things together. So Amar, can I throw that at you first, please?
Thanks. I think now with the lockdown, we see that it's possible to work together across different geographies. And I think one of the struggles that I had when I was a student inside Syria, for instance, I wouldn't have had access to any academic literature. I didn't have like an email at the university account or anything like that. So that was only impossible. So I'm giving this example is that now many people who reside in conflict zones, they are so open to learning and to sharing ideas and to create knowledge. And I think the question of through digital learning and sharing knowledge, that's a possible way to work together and to share ideas and to collaborate and exchange knowledge across different geographies. So we're sitting here, people are sitting in Mosul or other places. So how can we use the digital to enhance educational programs from architecture and engineering perspectives, for instance? So I think that would be a very crucial dimension for me to think about. But I think the medium itself, like looking at the video project itself, and if you want to call it a digital medium, that in itself more accessible for many people, because yes, it's great to have academic writings and books and literature, but it wouldn't reach out to wider people who might be working on the ground, and they would benefit widely from this knowledge. So how can we, if you want to use the word, democratize the way of reaching towards different audiences through digital means, through videos, through thinking about different ways of learning? I think here I can see crossing the gaps between different fields and bringing people back together from different backgrounds, because eventually ruined cities, they have to be rebuilt by people who have the technical skills, but also people who have the emotional attachment and also the intellectual understanding of these sides. So it has to be a combination of these different and maybe contrasted perspectives together.
Yeah, really good point. So ultimately, it is the digital, and it is the many ways in which digital can provide a space for us, coming from these very different backgrounds and very different skill sets. We have a question from Blen Te Gemada. Blen, would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yes. Hi. Hello, everyone. Thanks for a wonderful presentation. I just wanted to quickly ask if there are parallels to be drawn between loss of home and heritage in terms of war, and loss of home, and mostly loss of home in developing countries. I, for instance, coming from Ethiopia, and in my city, the kind of loss of homes and heritage that I've seen is driven by development. So roads being built and people having to move from areas that they've lived in for a long time and being relocated to suburbs where they no longer have their community and they no longer have their network. So that kind of destruction of their community and their urban context is the kind of loss I've experienced. And I was wondering what the panel thought about the similarities between the loss at that level and loss driven by war.
Really nice question, Blen. Leah, do you have anything to comment on that? And then I'll come to Amar and Sinan.
Well, I think I have very little to say, because I agree that the loss of home, whatever the circumstance, is very traumatizing, and I think that war adds an extra layer on top of that, because it adds the loss of life, the kind of destruction of the very means of livelihood. So it's not just a physical aspect, but I think also the communal, the personal, the psychological aspects. But I do agree, I think behind your question was a sense of how can we harness some of these approaches in all kinds of circumstances in which people lose their homes. And I think that one way, actually, and this ties into a previous question, is through crowdsourcing approaches. And this also ties it into Amar's answer of finding ways of bringing people together who have experienced such traumas. And one of the ways that I found to be very powerful was actually a project which the Econem company is undertaking at the moment, and they're trying to reconstruct one of the monuments which was destroyed in Palmyra, and they don't have any scans of it. So they're asking the community to contribute their personal photographs. And it has been just wonderful to see all the different responses and people coming together after this destruction to contribute towards something communally. So I think that we have to think of new ways, and maybe crowdsourcing is a way of kind of bringing together after this trauma and to try to kind of rebuild something new out of it.
Thank you very much, Leah. Amar, any reflections from you on that question?
Yeah, I think it's really, definitely the answer is yes, simply yes. There are lots of parallels and areas of similarities that you can see, even places where you don't have any active conflict in, as in Cairo, for instance, in Egypt. a lot of the traditional homes and the homes that they have been seen as informal in cities as in Cairo or in Beirut, and they are lost in the name of worlding or making these cities global, or in the name of regeneration and redevelopment, where you have a willful destruction of people's homes, where people aren't part of the conversation about shaping their own neighborhood and their own future. And I think this is where the term domicide or the killing of home comes to the conversation, that it's not only about places where you have conflict as in Syria or Iraq and Yemen, but also in places like China, where people who live in a village, they have the village erased and they have to be now in a block tower. You wouldn't have the right to choose which floor, when, where. Everything is decided for you. So this willful destruction of people's homes, it's everywhere. And I think this is the struggle that you can see across all these cases, that people's way of living has been collapsed because they didn't have the choice. It was by force that they have to be displaced or uprooted. So this sense of loss, it is in extreme situations as in conflict, but in less extreme situation where there is peace, between brackets, people are forced to be displaced and be somewhere else that they cannot even afford to live in the same location when that building is being rebuilt, and with all these fancy facades and swimming pools. They wouldn't afford to live in this place. So their way of living has changed through the powerful elites and economic powers.
Thank you. We've just got one more question which I'd like to try and cover before we close. Sarah Youssef has raised a question on the chat bar. Sarah, would you like to ask your question? And if so, unmute yourself when Katrin allows you.
Yes, first of all, I would like to thank the panelists for this awesome event. I know that we're in the middle of, well, very chaotic pandemic and all that, and it's kind of nice, sort of refreshing to see that people would still care about something such as heritage, which is, if you can say, is now relatively important compared to other things. So thank you for that. Now, as for my question, being an architecture engineering major or student perhaps, and of Syrian origin, and in the hopes of maybe one day returning back to Syria or Damascus and rebuilding all the monuments and rebuilding all the places that were destroyed, would you believe that it would be, let's say, accepted by the people, by the community, to rebuild those places exactly as they were because of the people's emotional, historical connections to them, or perhaps go a different way and rebuild them in a refurnished, in a new perspective, and maybe integrate the effect of what the country had gone through and survived, the war and all that. Yeah.
Thank you. That's a really great question, Sarah. I'd like controversially to pose that to Sinan first. What is the engineering perspective on this kind of question, Sinan? Should we rebuild things just as they were, or should we try and rebuild them in a way that reflects all the struggles and things that somewhere has gone through?
I think I'll give you a personal answer because I don't know if there is a unified engineering answer to this, but my personal answer would be it's a community choice, and it's about the values of attachment to that. There are dangers to building something completely new that looks out of place, and there are dangers to, I think, building something that's the poor representation of something that was already in place. So I think it could go either way, but perhaps what is important is from a restoration perspective or rebuilding perspective is to engage the community to find out what their desires are, and how feasible it is to rebuild everything, for instance, the way it is from a technological point of view, as well as all of the other points that we've discussed.
Thank you, Sinan. And Ammar, is that anything that any of your interviewees, when you were making your wonderful video, is that anything that has come up in your conversations?
Thanks. Can I ask if Abir wants to add on this? So one of my interviews actually is based in Homs in Syria. Abir, would you like to add anything on that if I allow myself to ask, or I will wait a few seconds? Maybe she's on mute. I think it's a very difficult question, and I agree totally with Sinan and what Leah said. It's a community decision to decide. But I have seen in many places, as in Hiroshima, for instance, the dome, or the Hiroshima Dome, or in Coventry Cathedral, where you kept the ruined cathedral and you built a brand new site next to it. And so sometimes the question is, do you keep the memory of the conflict itself as a reminder, so remembering the time of the conflict itself? So this is one question, but you have also the question of the buildings that they have been lost. Do you rebuild them again, or is it an opportunity to improve the quality of life? Do people want specific sites to be rebuilt exactly? I think it's a very big question that needs so much attention and conversation, and I'm just concerned that we're reaching the end. But thanks a lot, Sarah, for this great question.
Yes, and I'd like to echo that, and I'd like to thank everybody for their really good questions, and the panelists for fantastic contributions. But as we've got Lise Doucette here, and as we're so honoured to have her as our chair, could I just ask her to wrap it all up for us? I know that's a bit cheeky, but Lise, would you mind just saying a few words to finish?
Yeah. Thank you so much. This has been such an enriching discussion, and maybe I'll pick up from what Sarah began by asking whether in the midst of a pandemic, when we've all been locked down for months, whether it's the best time to have this kind of discussion. And I think I will agree with her that it is the best time, because we are all thinking about home these days, and perhaps some of us now believe we've been thinking about home far too much. But as you know, while we are home, it causes a lot of us to look inwards, to think about our own self, and understandably our own health, our family's health, those people close to us. But there are the leading voices of our time who say that none of us will be safe until all of us will be safe, and that the problems of our time, which have been emphasized again through this global health crisis, need global solutions in our time. And when we discuss about the loss of home and heritage and the rebuilding and reimagining of home and heritage, it is something which has to go beyond the hallowed halls of a university, as good as the University of Oxford is. It has to go beyond the refugee camps where people are basically absorbed and traumatized by their memories. And what better way than to focus on home? And often during, in covering the destruction, city after city in Syria over the past decade, I would ask friends and family, think of what matters to you on your street. Think of the pub, think of the restaurant, think of the shops you love, think of the square that you love. Well, imagine if they were all in ruin. All of the memories, all of the life as you knew it was all in ruin, including your home. How would you feel? And I think this is a time for greater empathy and understanding. And, Ollie, you're the one who brought up about the statues, and we're thinking about history as never before. And as William Faulkner, the American writer, said, the history is not yet dead. It's not even past yet. And the people are asking, what is history? There's the history of the museums, and there's the history of the statues. And statues literally are people who are being put on a pedestal, those that we should revere and respect. And I think people are saying to us, well, who chooses those statues? And are the statues truthful? And the slave trader Colston in Bristol, what did the plaque say? The plaque said he was a wise and virtuous man, and this statue put up so many years after his death was put up by the community. But actually that wasn't the case. The statue was put up by some prominent business people, and he wasn't a wise and virtuous man. He built his fortune on the back of a slave trade. So I think I agree with the historian David Olusoga, who said that perhaps some of these statues in public squares, where they are places for everyone to walk by, and that some of these statues are an affront to people's stories, that their rightful place perhaps is in a museum, which doesn't mean we have to tear everything down. I think this is a time for understanding and for empathy. And so as the journalist in this room, may I end with a practical suggestion? May Oxford University back a project to make the clock tower now appearing in the refugee camps, the clock tower of Homs, displace the Eiffel Tower as the icon of our time to inspire people the world over.
That's a wonderful challenge, Lise. We will see how we can respond to that. Thank you very much. And thank you everybody for a really thought-provoking and truly interdisciplinary event. Thank you.